thank you so much for joining with us today. Uh, I was so
Thank you.
excited because we have a lot to talk about, and I'm sure we can, go ahead with a couple of things that, you are already familiar with and you are engaging with in the field of humanities and arts. Yeah, to start off with the discussion, so as an associate professor of the humanities and arts, or what kind of teaching and research engagement in the humanities do you do at the moment?
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Tilini, thank you so much for having me. And I hope we can have some good discussion about humanities research and pedagogy. And to start off, to answer your question, I am a professor of post-colonial studies and English literature here at IIT Indore. My research group, as we call it in our institute, is called the Digital Humanities and Publishing Research Group. So if I were to kind of give you an overview, I write, speak about humanities education in India generally, but in my research, my work is very focused on the digital humanities now. I was a very traditional post-colonial studies scholar, and my first two books actually focus on reimagining the post-colonial canon. Right? And through that book and through the research that I did from there, I developed this group of research students to see how we can kind of, look at digital humanities to expand and rethink the boundaries of humanities education in India. Have we been able to do that? I think we have made some steps. I've had research students who have worked on very interesting research questions. We have tried to merge what is called the theory and praxis of humanities education. So I find digital humanities as a kind of a fertile ground where you can have that intersection. And on this, in the meanwhile, a group of us scholars in digital humanities across India, we co-founded what is called Dharti, or Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovation. Yeah. And I'm the president of that organization, for the founding president. And we are trying then to see how we can push the thinking as well as the doing of humanities research across institutions, and not have this kind of real strong interdisciplinarity confined to some elite institutions like the IITs. So that is our objective in that organization. And it is also my objective as a research group, and working with and mentoring my students to kind of ask innovative questions in their research work. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely it does. As far as I remember, when I was doing a bit of research on your work, I saw that you've given a talk on introducing digital humanities in India last year. And it kind of made me thinking, like, there is this notion that, using the digital inquiry, or using these computational methods to address research questions, right? It kind of pushes the human inquiry to take a back seat in the arts and humanities. What kind of take do you have on that?
It is well, it's a question that that the digital humanities has always kind of confronted. Not just in India, but in North America, in Europe, in other places too. And this is something that I tell my students, and whenever I give a lecture somewhere in any university in India, I tell them that I don't think that doing digital humanities fundamentally changes the questions that you ask. Our mandate and our job as humanities scholars is to question, to critique, and to kind of, ask fundamental questions about, say, about education, about politics, about history, all of these varied disciplines, right?
Mhm.
I don't believe those questions change.
Okay.
So my simple answer to our students would be that, if your research will be enhanced and made better by the use of digital tools, you should use them, right?
Right.
That is one part of the answer. The
Mhm.
second part of it is that as humanities scholars, we have to be very conscious and cognizant of the fact that a lot of those very questions are now being, you know are now being discussed in a digital ecosystem, in a digital
Okay. Mhm.
on digital platforms,
Platforms.
right?
Okay.
So in some way, if we do not, remember materiality of the book, right? The
Mhm.
book is a technology,
Mhm.
and we try to understand the materiality of the book and the publishing process. What gets published, what does not get published, who narrates, who does not narrate, who has a voice, who does not have a voice. All of that works into, like, the material study of the book as a technology, right?
Right.
for
Mhm.
us for us to be able to do that effectively, you really need to understand how that industry functions, and we have done that, in humanities research.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, Similarly, if questions about privacy, if questions about, what data the state can have or cannot have,
Mhm.
how is that data being used, if all of that is done in the material infrastructures of the digital, to
Okay.
some extent, we need to know how those infrastructures are set up
Mhm.
and how those infrastructures are deployed or used, right? You cannot, we have always felt as humanities scholars, and I continue to repeat that now,
Mhm.
that technology is too important to be left only to the technocrats.
Okay.
it,
Uh-huh.
it shapes all of us. It
Mhm.
transforms the way we think about things, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And if and it is very important for us to be part of that conversation, right?
Mhm.
Implicitly, explicitly, you should be there both at the conceptualization, the
Mhm.
implementation, and the deployment of those technologies. And if you continue to ask those questions
Mhm.
in emerging places like India, you will get to a point where one of my students will probably be involved in building a particular technology from scratch, right? And so some of these ethical questions, moral questions, privacy questions would perhaps inform the building of a technology at that stage,
Okay.
isn't it?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I don't see this as very different from any other technology. So one of the things I have said, I don't say that so often now, but in the earlier speech talks I've given, I know I've said that, that digital humanities is only something that would eventually be known as just humanities. Yeah, that
Okay.
it would become very ubiquitous. It would
Mhm.
become something that, all of us as humanities scholars would be interacting and engaging with. Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't think the traditional, in other words, I don't think that the traditional humanities can ever be replaced or should be replaced.
Mhm.
Yeah. I only think that you can augment those questions in more effective ways, if
Mhm.
we understand the new ecosystems in which those very traditional questions interact and function.
Right. Right. I mean, I understand that even the digital humanities in Sri Lanka is quite, in its nascent stage, and there are a lot of discussions around it. Could you give us a couple of examples, like a couple of projects that you've done in order to, get a better hang of what kind of engagement, especially in terms of, like what kind of ethical engagement are you engaged in, especially using the digital infrastructure in research?
Okay, yeah. So you want to know about my projects, right? I mean, the
Uh,
ones that I have been involved with. Because if
anything is
you,
ready. Yeah.
okay, so because, so let me start by saying that, there are a lot of wonderful scholars
Mm-hmm.
around India who are doing some great projects.
Right.
There have been projects that, like the Vichitra or the project Madurai, which were
Mm-hmm.
around when, digital humanities didn't even exist as a field. So it is not that these questions were not being asked by people before the discipline as an area study came into being. So, and so there is work going on in different parts of the country in various kinds of projects. I will talk about a couple of projects that our lab has been doing. Yeah. One is that we have, and I can send you the link later on. One of my core interests in digital humanities is making research accessible to students across the country. Uh, and to have publishing, both publishing avenues as well as, you know, reading and accessing avenues of research. Right now, a lot of the good research in the humanities across the world is, you know, people don't have access to that research because they are behind paywalls. So I'm a big believer in open access science, open access humanities research, and how do we ensure that we have an open access system that is sustainable, equitable, as well as rigorous. So we have developed a platform at IIT Indore, which is called knowledge sharing in the knowledge sharing in publishing, SHIP. I will send you the link later on.
Sure.
And what we are trying to do through that is to solicit as well as, you know, host perhaps journals, not just in English, but also scholarship across different languages in India. We are, and it's completely open access. So anyone who is a student in a small college, you know, in some other part of India, will be able to access it. It is still very much in its nascent stage. And hopefully, you know, we will have the funds as well as some support to help it grow. But I do believe that in the next decade, that is going to be crucially important. Now, you know, it's important at two levels. It's important, of course, for access, but it is also important for our researchers within around South Asia, not just in India, you know, the global South, to have platforms where they can publish their research and where, you know, they can actually reach out to a community of researchers and scholars. Right now, I think those avenues are far too few, and they are mostly, you know, in the hands of big publishers, and most of those are located in the global north. And even though that there's an outreach to the global south to be included in those publications, I believe that we need an ecosystem of our own that can compete both at the level of the rigor as well as access for our students. So that we are trying that. Within that, you know, I come from a background of literature, right? So, you know, so the other project that I'm doing, and then I'll tell you about a project that one of my students is doing. You know, we found that we have had electronic literature volumes. There have been 3 volumes of electronic literature, volume 1, 2, and 3, that was published from the United States. And when we went through those volumes, we realized that there was not a single entry from South Asia. You know? And so it got me thinking as to, is it that, you know, people in South Asia do not write electronic poetry or electronic literature or produce electronic literature? Is it that they have not been approached or did not know about the publishing of these anthologies and hence have never submitted to them, right? Or are they doing it in languages other than English and therefore, you know, do not get space to be published? So what we are trying to do now, and we are hoping to publish that sometime this year, is to publish an anthology of electronic literatures, a multilingual anthology of electronic literature. So, you know, right now we have gotten mostly, you know, entries from India. I'm happy to send you the link, and if we can get entries from other places in South Asia, that would be just wonderful, you know. So we have, like, you know, in Tamil, in Bengali, in Malayalam, Marathi. So, you know, we have gotten entries and we are hoping to publish that sometime this year. And if we are able to do that successfully, then that would be actually the first volume of electronic literature. right?
Okay.
Now, so the thinking in terms of digital humanities, for example, the thinking for me was, is it, this is a place that has produced poetry,
Okay.
right? Has a long history of literature and poetry,
Mhm.
in oral, literal, whatever forms you want to think of, right?
Mhm.
It seems kind of out of place that, when there is a whole body of electronic literature being produced, that, that about 1.5 billion people around South Asia were doing nothing about it. Right?
Okay.
That was a bit hard to imagine,
Okay.
and so that's why we thought that, there's need for this. So that, that's one digital anthology that should be coming out sometime, hopefully in the next 6 months, 6 to 10 months. Uh, the third one is like, what one of my students is doing about, a partition. So,
Okay. Mhm.
documenting and creating an archive of what we like to call peripheral partition stories and partition narratives. So it's a project that she's working on, and she has just finished a dissertation, and will probably be, full-time working on that archive. So we
Okay.
are hoping to get that out. I have another student who finished her PhD in digital humanities and is currently a postdoc scholar who works on, digital fiction, and looks at, now this is another part of digital humanities, looks at, literature across a period of say 50 years, and do a quantitative semantic kind of analysis of it. So that's a kind of an empirical study of literature, which Martin Eve likes to call, close reading with computers.
Okay.
So it's like you combine a close reading with distant reading, and see if your analysis of these texts shows up some interesting, some interesting analysis. I don't want to take it away from her, so I'm sure she will be
Certainly.
writing and speaking about it.
Certainly. Certainly.
So yeah, so these are just some examples, and we have, people working on graphic narratives, yeah, and so lots of exciting stuff, I think,
Absolutely. Yeah.
in DH. Yeah.
Yeah. So just one more
So
question, please.
anytime my
Yeah.
answer is too long,
No,
you
no,
can
no,
just
no,
stop me.
absolutely. No, no, absolutely not. Because there's a lot that we can talk about this. Just one more question, since we are talking about digital humanities, a more kind of general broad question. Like, what are the possibilities that you see in the digital humanities for, for social, economic, political transformation? For example, if we step outside the academia, or step outside, fields, subjects like literature and theory, what kind of possibilities do you see, maybe in the context of India, for this kind of transformation at large?
Okay, so I want to kind of, show you a report that we did for the ministry.
Okay, right.
So this is called the Grand Challenges in the Humanities.
Okay.
So this was a result of a workshop that I did with the Professor Sumati Ramaswamy from Duke University, who is also the president of American Institute of Indian Sciences. And this was the outcome of a workshop that we did, brainstorming with academics across India and internationally, to think about, in the next 10 years, what are the big challenges in humanities research, right? So, I won't answer your question only as digital humanities, which I think digital humanities is very much a part of it. Yeah. But one of, so we have 10 challenges that we have written down, right?
Okay.
So those 10 challenges can, it's like digital humanities, environmental humanities, decolonizing knowledge systems. So there's a whole range of, areas that we kind of cohered around, that these are the areas that we need research work in. One of those areas, at number 4, is what we call the public humanities.
Okay.
Yeah. And what the public humanities, so I will just read this out to you.
Yeah,
That's okay.
No problem. Yeah,
It's a very small this.
Yeah.
So the public humanities section says that this challenge responds to the assumption that the humanities are esoteric and irrelevant for the needs of today, and makes humanities scholarship more visible and accessible by the creation of knowledge for an engaged citizenry. So what it does is defining and refining what it means to be human in modern India,
Okay.
reforming humanities pedagogy and curricular reform at all education levels, including experiments and innovations in school, exploring the role of pluralism and diversity in India, as well as India's connections and interactions over time and into the present with the rest of Asia and the world at large, and developing skill sets among scholars of humanities to write for a general public and citizenry. So that is something that, which is why I was so interested in your work,
Yeah.
because I do think that we don't do that anymore. We have reconciled ourselves to the notion of the ivory tower. And the notion of the public intellectual, which which I think the French still have some modicum of it left, and in India was very vibrant, but perhaps a bit centralized. So so there were some big rock stars who we will always listen to, and they're always great to know about. But given, coming back to the digital, given this plethora of platforms that we have now, right, teach our scholars to reach out and explain, their research, their findings, intersections. And I think that is the way you educate a citizenry. And I think that is nothing to do with digital humanities. It is to do with the original mandate of the humanities, right? That's what you're supposed to do. Hold states to account, hold democracies to account, hold like your moral and philosophical agendas to account. And I think the digital is just one way of doing that, and I think the young people are doing it so well. So we need to support that, we need to facilitate that, rather than say that, they don't have a PhD yet, I mean, how can they talk about this, or what are the... So there are many creative ways in which you see young people doing that. And the net, at least so far, is more democratized right now, and so you can use those platforms, right? Absolutely. And so let's facilitate them and kind of give them more more audiences and platforms to speak for. So that's one. In terms of a concrete example of digital humanities, as you asked in your question, is I want you to think about the Facebook controversy, quote unquote, that happened in India about like 3 years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, where Facebook came out with this, whole package called Facebook Basics. Yeah, and it was sold in India as that everybody in India, in the smallest village, will get free internet, right, and will have a certain bandwidth, and so. However, if you were not a technocrat, the larger point seemed to be to actually make the internet a more restricted space, from moving it from a free space to a more restrictive space, right? A lot of scholars understood that. A lot of, there was a whole discussion on it, and a report was submitted to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, citing the ethical problems with that proposal. And it was finally struck down and, did not happen. I don't want to get too much into the details of it. Yeah. However, suffice to say that we all know that nobody, certainly not big corporate entities, are going to stop with one attempt, right? So the only way in a democracy to put a check on those attempts is to ensure an engaged and educated citizenry, right? And if we don't tell them about how algorithms are not really neutral, how are they produced, how are they deployed, I think that is how is that not humanities research is my question, To me, that's it's nothing to do with algorithms. It's everything to do with philosophy and ethics and all the traditional humanities challenges that we have always dealt with, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. Yeah.
Doctor, like now you're teaching at Indian Institute of Technology, and when I was going through the National Education Policy for 2020 in India, so I will just read out that part. This was section, I guess this page, I'll let you know the page number. It says a holistic and multidisciplinary education, as described so beautifully in India's past, is indeed what is needed for the education of India to lead the country into the 21st century and the fourth industrial revolution. Even engineering institutions such as the IITs will move towards more holistic and multidisciplinary education with more arts and humanities. Students of arts and humanities will aim to learn more science and all will make an effort to incorporate more vocational subjects and soft skills. This is page number 37. I would like to know what is teaching the humanities and arts, especially at a technological or technology-oriented institute. What does it entail for you?
That's a very good question. I think for one, I want your viewers also to know that the humanities and social sciences as a department and a school has been part of the IIT's statutes right from 1950.
Right.
Yeah. So it was, it was embedded into the constitution of the IITs that if you were going to have world-class technocrats, as the IITs were originally conceived to be, you cannot have have them not understand humanistic subjects. So even in the original formation of the IITs, the humanities were a very important part, right? Currently, you do, I think somewhere in between, maybe they became in some ways perceived. I don't think it was ever true in reality, but I think they came to be perceived as some service departments, right? That you learn your economics and you learn your English and that's all what the humanities do, right? But I think that has changed. So if you look at any IIT right now, including the second generation IITs like mine, we contribute to the engineering students programs, the BTech programs. They have minor in humanities and social sciences. Many of them opt to take that minor. They have liberal arts minors, economics minors. So students opt for that all the time, which means that they are taking far more humanities courses than just the core courses. Core courses, which they have to take for their engineering, but they end up taking a lot of elective courses through their 4 years. And apart from that, the humanities and social sciences in every IIT also has very vibrant masters and PhD programs of their own. So you do have students who are studying in the IITs only for their humanities courses. Right? So that of course is a completely different group, and so we teach them differently. But for the engineering students, what I have found is that in some ways we are very lucky. That irrespective of the fact that a lot of our students want to be engineers, we still get the cream of the student population in India, because the JEE is such a tough exam to crack, and it's a very the best students in the country are coming to the IITs, right? So you have a very good group to begin with. So what we have found, I have found certainly, and I know that this is the experience of many of my colleagues too, is that they may not come in thinking that they want to do a course in philosophy or in literature, right? But they are the kind of students that if you throw something at them, they will bite, and if you challenge them, they like a challenge, right? Sometimes you have to kind of change your pedagogy, tweak it to make it interesting to them, right? So that, you know, you can use their natural skills or their natural inclinations to think through some of the humanities questions that we want them to think through, right? You know, to kind of develop their writing skills, to reflect a certain nuance, you know, and we hope that they will carry that nuance and understanding of the complexity of their societies
Mhm.
to their workplace or to their roles of leadership in corporations. You know, I mean, that's a hope that every teacher has, right? So that's what we hope to. And it is, it is not any more of a challenge, I think, than teaching any group of diverse students.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One thing I will add is one of the characteristics of a group of engineering students in their first year to who we do teach core courses
Mhm.
is that many of them come with absolutely no background in English, you know. And this is sometimes, you know, your class is the first one that they're attending, where the medium of instruction is English. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
So so the so challenge for someone like me is kind of double edged. Yeah.
Okay.
On the
Mhm.
one hand, I want to facilitate them so that, you know, they, it makes their education through this degree easier, you know, and smoother, which I
Mhm.
do try to do. Uh, on the other hand, I don't want any student to ever go out of my class thinking that their lack of skill or lack of proficiency in the English language somehow reflects their, you know, intellectual capability, you know.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of us embody that. Most faculty members, you know, not just in my discipline, across disciplines. So I think it's good for them to see that, it's good for them to learn from that. So, you know, having uh, you know, English as the medium of instruction in higher education is a colonial legacy that we have come to live with.
Mhm.
However, I do think that that does not need to stem them in any way. And I think we try to do that. How
Yeah.
far are we successful? You know, I don't know.
Uh,
Mhm.
this might be a little tricky area that I'm going to sort of come into. Um, well, like what kind of like do you see the hierarchy between the engineering faculties and the School of the Humanities being somehow, you know, leveled just because there is, you know, you attempt to, you know, provide this
Mm,
kind of
mm.
holistic understanding of, you know, the world and to critically engage with it. Do you see that kind of, you know, leveling of hierarchies or change of attitudes in the students?
See, you know, I'll try and answer that in a couple of ways.
Mhm.
One is within our institute, I think that, you know, there is no hierarchy in terms of perception among faculty
Uh-huh.
members.
Okay.
I don't believe there is. You know, I think
Mhm.
we all have mutual respect for the work each of us does because we all
Mhm.
are
Mhm.
researchers, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, in terms of funding and resources, I think, you know, the humanities and social sciences, like anywhere else in the world, get you know, get a raw deal. Yeah. It is relative. You know,
Mhm.
at an IIT, I'm perhaps, you know, better placed than maybe some of my colleagues in the university.
Okay.
Yeah. But yes, you know, within that system, the understanding is that, you know, the kind of resources and money you need for sciences with their experiments and their equipment, or engineering with their heavy equipment, are not the same as that for the humanities, right? And so there is a lack of understanding of what kind of resources that we need, and I think we are working to change that. And hopefully, you know, we'll get some headway in that. Hierarchy, I think, is more about, you know, I mean,
Mhm.
mm, if someone wants to feel hierarchical about their own positions, that's their, that's their call. We don't really give a damn. Yeah. But, but I also want to say that structurally there is no difference if you're in a public
Right,
university.
right.
So there is pay parity, there is resource parity. There is no sense of like, if you are a humanities faculty member. And the reason I mention that is that I know that in universities in the United States, for example, there is pay parity is not a given. However, in public institutions in India, it is a given. So structurally, there isn't. Resource distribution wise, there is still some way to go. We need to still do some work, especially in areas like digital humanities, where I feel that it is very difficult to even make an argument that look, my lab needs some money, right? Because they were like, I mean, humanities, why do you guys need money, right? As long as we give you access to the library, that should be enough, right? And so making the case is a bit harder, right?
Okay.
And if it is hard for me in an IIT, I can imagine it will be much harder for someone in a university or in a college or in a small liberal arts college, right? So that perception has to change. And we in Dharti, or with the Digital Humanities Alliance, one of the things we are hoping to do is, like the MLA does, is to create those policy documents that will convey to universities what researchers or scholars in these particular fields do need and should be expected to do, right? So we hope to do that in the coming years.
That's wonderful. Doctor, moving on to sort of the national education policy a bit again. Do you find it resonates with the proposal that you have drafted and sort of presented, like the humanities, the proposal? Do you find any resonance?
That's a tough question, actually. And I'll try and answer it like this, that I do think that when you look at the national education policy draft, there are some very good things in it.
Okay.
And implementation is always key. And anywhere, I think it is especially key in India.
Okay.
So we'll see how that rolls out. But they have some very good points there, which I think, if implemented in the right way, will in the long run benefit education, higher education in India. I'm only focusing on higher education because that's my forte. I know that there are lots of other things for school education too. I do believe that the centralization, or making the humanities and social sciences, as you just read out, they specifically mentioned IITs, making the humanities and social sciences an integral part of these institutions is a welcome step. I will take it. And I think, I hope, and my hope, and I think my conviction is that we have extraordinary scholars in the humanities and social sciences across India in different universities. They will be able to harness that to outcomes that will be beneficial for a pluralistic society such as ours, right? So that focus on the humanities being important is, I think, is very good. Because one of the things I've always believed in, one of the things that, I did my PhD from the United States. One of the things I've always liked about the US system is that, 4-year undergraduate degree, which includes, that core liberal arts, as Martha Nussbaum has written, was a very important element of your undergraduate education, irrespective of whether you go on to become engineers or doctors or lawyers or what have you, right? So I do believe that in a democratic system, that training of critical thinking is indispensable, I think, and more so today than ever before. I truly believe that. So let's see. Fingers crossed. I mean, I'm willing to give this or future governments benefit of doubt
Mhm.
and say that, okay, you're saying the right things,
Uh-huh.
now do the right things.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So let's see.
Right. So, at a previous interview that I've done with an emeritus professor at the US Amherst, his Professor Robert Norwood, he said he talked about the MIT in America and the introduction of the humanities, the liberal arts to its engineers. So basically, it was what happened was when the engineers were like climbing up the ladder, when they come to a position where they are eligible to get management positions, they lose to the liberal art graduates who come from universities like Yale, Princeton, whatever. It's because these liberal arts graduates are more equipped to host these.
Yeah.
They have this
Yeah.
particular culture, host the parties, the cocktail parties, write very elegantly and all that, right? So that aspect of cultural capital is lacking in them. So that was why the humanities was integrated into the MIT, right? So to serve a very functional kind of purpose. And I also hear like discussions. I can only talk about Sri Lanka. I also hear discussions about how humanities can produce better engineers, better doctors who are very sensitive. It's kind of like a very double-edged kind of very double-edged sword kind of thing. When we are talking about this. But anyways, the question that I want to ask next is like when I was going through the MEP, what I realized was like it also resonates with something that other countries like Australia, for example, attempt in the humanities, like reforms in the humanities field. For example, creating this employable graduate in the humanities, create this productive graduate who can, participate in the economy, create this graduate with the soft skills and the technological skills and vocational skills. What do you think about that? What's your take on that?
Well, I understand why some of us in the humanities would be a bit uncomfortable with that notion, right? Yeah. And as someone who is a math graduate myself, yeah, and I do think that we come from a place, at least India does, even now, yeah, where a majority of our graduates, irrespective of your discipline, are going to college because they want to come out and have an employment, right? Get a useful employment that will take care of them or their families or whatever be your trajectory. I'm not dismissive of that objective, to be very honest, because I do think it's a need, it's a necessity. Even the IIT students who come, one of the things about the IITs is that if you have an IIT degree, you will land a job. It's, I mean, the placement is like 100%. And so many of them come from families where they are the first graduate in their family, the first generation IITian. Right? And some, I have actually met students who in the third year of their engineering kind of realized that, look, maybe I didn't want to be an engineer, maybe I wanted to do something in the humanities, right? However, they will still finish their engineering and they will have a job because they know that that is a promise that they make their families, and they do think that they need that, right? So I think you look at it in two different ways. One is that, yes, I'm always happy to say that, yes, we do give employable skills, and that critical thinking that you develop, that kind of understanding human interactions that you develop doing humanities courses will help you in whatever career you want to do. So I think that is okay. And I also think that there should be space for, knowledge production and learning the humanities for its own sake, for getting an education that is not merely utilitarian, right? Yeah. Utility can be and should be perhaps a byproduct, because even when I do a PhD, or if my students do a PhD with me, they are looking for how to put that PhD to use, right? Yeah. So I don't see anything wrong with that. I do think that that should be not only focused on its utilitarianism. I do think that, yes, that will be there, but you acquire knowledge because, it furthers you, it furthers your mind, and it furthers humankind, right? So, it has to have all of those elements. But I think within the university system, the 20th century German system of the university that was developed, is kind of testament to the fact that that we are in the industrial revolution, and the university becomes that one space from where you give products to this capitalist industrial society, right? So much as our intellect might resist that, the reality has been that from the beginning of the university. At least unless you go back to the Buddhist monasteries in the early times, it's pretty much been that, right? So no harm there.
Okay.
But let's not make it only about that.
Absolutely. So we'll just move into our area or our territory for a bit. I was attending a conference online recently, and it was a post-colonial literature conference. And I heard during one of the keynote addresses that this academic said that we cannot be, and I'm going to quote what this academic said, we cannot be properly post-colonial unless we decolonize the curriculum.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing what your take on this, especially linking this to the academic debates that you have in India regarding decolonization.
Oh, we could just talk 1 hour about this. I agree with the premise of that. I totally agree with the premise that you have to decolonize the curriculum, right? But I also know that decolonizing the curriculum is a very Western UK concept, right? So they're talking about decolonization in ways that I totally understand as a post-colonial scholar. When I use that term in the context of India, I have to be very careful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have to be careful in 2 ways. One is that, yes, the curriculum in India also needs decolonization, right? It also needs to be rethought, reimagined, and transformed in some ways, right? However, decolonizing the curriculum should not be a euphemism for a certain regressive form of education. Right? It should harness it, as the earlier part of the NEP that you read out, it can certainly harness, the rich civilizational heritage that we have, across South Asia. And it can certainly harness some of those texts that may have been missed or have not been studied, in the intervening years in India. It should also include, not merely the Sanskrit and the Pali texts, that may have been overlooked in our curriculum, for some time. It should also include a very open debate and deliberation on the role of caste. It should also include how, even in a post-colonial space, in spite of our structural and constitutional efforts, we still have a long way to go in terms of inclusion in our diversity. So decolonizing the curriculum for in an Indian context, to me, is a much more complex exercise, and it does not and should not mean erasure of anything, uh, especially of memory. Uh, it should not be simply something to assuage uh, uh, a kind of an imagined national shame, you know. So because you do deal with those kind of rhetorics too in public discourse in India. Uh, and I think we need to be very careful when we use that term in India. So to give you a concrete example, you know, you want to include Bhaskaracharya's Lilavati, you know, a mathematical classic from the School of Mathematics in India into a curriculum. I'm all for it. I think, yes, let's do that. Let's see what we learn from that, right? Now, if the outcome of that is that the pedagogy is that you are taught to revere that rather than critique it or engage with it, you know, I think that is a wrong direction. You know, I think every text is a narrative, whether irrespective of what time it comes from, and every text has to be engaged with critically, and we should not shy away from either the gaps or the questions that those texts will raise, sometimes uncomfortable ones, especially when they're uncomfortable ones. So if you are a mature democracy, if you are a mature educational institution, you should not shy away from asking those tough questions. And so in that sense, yes, you know, I'm you know, yes to the decolonization, but with deliberation. Let's put it like that.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Madam, my last question is again regarding what we work with. I would like to know, like, you also play an administrative role at your university as the head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Like, what kind of support do you give for like first generation students in, you know, let's say in the English department?
To which students? Can you repeat that?
First generation students. First generation.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. So those, I assume, have like those.
Well, you know,
yeah.
I think the IITs have a very good system for doing that. You know, it's a very well established. I don't think I had to do anything particularly, you know, groundbreaking on that level. We have a very good system by which, you know, for example, if you are coming from a first generation family who does not have the necessary skills to begin your engineering education, like right off the bat, right? You have a full semester of preparatory courses. So these are preparatory courses from both your engineering, you know, core disciplines, as well as from across other disciplines, the sciences, the humanities, and you will have these specialized courses, and then you go on, you know, to do your regular academic work from the next semester. Or since we are a public institution, you know, as you know that, you know, the tuitions and those are fairly nominal in India. And plus, if you are also coming from certain backgrounds, both economically or socially, you basically don't pay any tuition. So all of this is on the institution, to take care of that. Then, of course, you know, you have other curricular and extracurricular kind of groups and, you know, peer groups which the institution has, and that where I won't be very qualified to speak on what exact things that they do, but I know that they do form communities and come together and, you know, to support them. So then the language issue, you know, which is always a big issue for students of certain backgrounds from rural areas of India. You know, we have a lab services that are there for them, like throughout their 4 years of study. And one of the system, you know, while the university system in India is considered to be hierarchical, I'm not quite sure because I've not worked in a university, but at least I know that within an IIT system, faculty doors are always open. You can always walk, you could be a first year student, you can walk into a faculty office, you can talk to them. So I do think that, we do try, but I cannot say that it's something that, I have done in any particular individual way. It's an institutional culture. We also have a counseling center, faculty. All of us are obliged to be faculty advisors to a group of students every semester. So these are group of students who can, come to you for both academic as well as non-academic problems that they may face on campus. So there are many mechanisms that kind of work with each other. And call on each other or harness each other when you need them. However, I also want to not discount the fact that I'm quite aware that we are in an IIT, and across the IITs, there is a lot of student stress too. The academic demands are very high. It's difficult. Yeah, and sometimes you do hear of incidents that you don't ever want to hear in your institute, but touch wood, so far we have been good, but and hopefully we'll continue to strengthen those services. But I do want to stress that in the public university, this is why I'm such a big advocate of public universities and public university systems across India, and the IITs are one of those, is that we still have students who are first generation students and who come from socioeconomic backgrounds, for who education would be a privilege and a luxury if we did not have public institutions. And I think it is, with the RTE, the Right to Education Act, I think it is mandatory for the state to ensure access to these opportunities. And so, at least for the coming couple of generations, I think we totally need these public institutions to function as public institutions.
I assume that even in your department, it's the case, right? Like even in the English department setting, because for them, like the first generation students, and I'm one, it can be very difficult to if you do not have previous exposure to English literature or kind of an anglicized background at home, it can be challenging for them to navigate the department.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, see, that is one of the things, like when you asked me about my interventions in the humanities in India, that is one of the things where I have found in my institution as well as in other good institutions across India, where the STEM fields have done far better than we have. I have always found that universities and the humanities and social science departments in universities do kind of put far more pressure on the student who does not have an anglicized background. Because the requirement of writing is much more, and so it just becomes easier on the system if a student comes in with a certain basic level of skill sets, right? I can only say that in my research group, I have consciously tried to change that. And my students will be able to tell you if I've been successful. I do think I have to some extent, where I constantly emphasize that that the work is more important than the language, number one. And number two, if you get the work right, if you ask your research questions right, the language will come along, it will fall in place. And on the flip side, I don't care if you write Dickensian language, if I think that the research substance there is not is not enough. So I kind of try to balance that, and I have had students who came in with very low language skills, and hopefully they have learned something on their way out. So
That's absolutely wonderful. Dr. Vivian, is there anything that you'd like to add that I couldn't ask you? Is there anything that you would like to add as a final remark?
Um, no, not really, but
Mm-hmm.
thank you very much for having me. And I really
Yeah.
enjoyed this conversation with you. I don't know, like, I mean, I would love to at some point maybe have a conversation with someone from Sri Lanka, maybe, an academic, so we can exchange notes.
Yeah.
That would
Yeah.
be great. Uh, I do think that we in the global south, especially in South Asia, need to have more collaborations. I do think I want to know what is happening in Sri Lanka. What are the academics there? What are they working
Mm-hmm.
on, or
Mm-hmm.
in Bangladesh, or in
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
Or even a little bit, in China, in Japan. Uh, so I do think we need to have. Let me put it like this: I think we need to shift oceans. Let's, like, look at the Indian Ocean, and let's see what kind of conversations we have there, right? For far too much, especially in post-colonial studies, which is my field, we have focused on the Atlantic for some strange reason. Yeah. And while that's great, I think we can kind of turn the ship around a little bit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Milan. It was
Thank you so much,
yeah,
Trini, and I'm so
it was,
glad you're doing this.
and I'm so glad you could join us because it was such a fruitful discussion. We could get to know each other and what our engagements are, and really thankful. And like I will like to have you in a future episode too, if that's not too much, of a
Sure,
commitment. Yeah, and
sure, sure.
yeah, I'll see you soon again. And thank you very much, Dr.
Okay.
Menon. Okay, bye bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.